Hi everyone, my name is Brittany J. Jones and I am so excited to be stepping in for Mimi G. She's currently traveling on business and asked me to record the sew alongs for her new Summer Simplicity patterns 8889 as well as 8890. In this video, we're going to be sewing along to View B on Simplicity 8889, and I hope to bring you that same Mimi G swag that we all know and love. So let's get started. Before we begin, I'll go over the pattern pieces that we need to cut out to make the pants on this pattern. And if you are wondering the types of fabric that would work great, on the back of the envelope there is a list of suggested fabrics as well as the notions and the yardage that you need to purchase. The first pattern piece to cut out is 13. This is the flap. We need to cut out 4 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. Piece 18 is the side flap. We need 4 of fabric and 2 of interfacing. Piece 15, this is our underlap. We need 1 of fabric and 1 of interfacing. Piece 14, this is the fly. We need 1 of fabric and 1 of interfacing. Piece 19, this is the carrier and we need to cut 1. We need to cut out piece 17, which is our side pocket, and we need to cut 2. Piece 20, this is the waistband. We cut 1 of fabric and 1 of interfacing. Pattern piece 12 is the front and we need to cut 2 of these. And pattern piece 16, this is the back. We need 2 of these as well. Once you have your pattern pieces and your fabric cut out, you've transferred all of your markings, we can start sewing. The first step for us to do is to apply stay stitching along the upper edge of our front pant. The stay stitching will be done at a 1/2 inch seam allowance. Once you have the stay stitching done along the top edge of the pant, we can go ahead and start working on the left front. Now there was a stitching line that was on the pattern piece for us to transfer. So if you did not transfer yours, you can go ahead and transfer it now. That stitching line will be a guide for us later when it's time to sew the fly. So using a water soluble pen, this is what I use, or you can hand baste your stitching line. Let's go ahead and transfer that marking now. Now that you have your stitching line transferred, we can move on to the next step. Still working on the left front, you should have transferred a large circle that's down here toward the end of the fly. We're going to reinforce that by stitching about 1 inch above it and 1 inch below, and make sure that you stitch right through the large circle. So let's go ahead and do that now. And to reinforce this large circle, I'm lined up with the stitching line, so I'm at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and I'm just going to stitch about 1 inch above and 1 inch below that large circle. Make sure again that you stitch right through it. I have the left front reinforced through the large circle. Before I go on to the next step, because at the next step we're going to put our pants right sides facing and we're going to stitch between the large circle and the notch. Before I do that, I want to go ahead and finish off my center seam. I just like to have all my seams finished off, so I'm going to go ahead and do that now before we start putting them together. So again, I'm going to go ahead and finish off my center seam right here with my serger. Okay, so I went ahead and finished off this raw edge. Now we're going to put right sides facing. We're going to match up our notches as well as our large dot. Pin in place. Now we're going to stitch between this large circle and this notch at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance, and make sure that you back stitch at the beginning and the end. Now that we have them reinforced between the large circle and the notch, we are going to go ahead and clip the left front only, not the right. We're going to clip it to that large circle that we reinforced. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my scissors here. And make sure that you just clip to the large dot, don't clip through your stitching. Now we can move on to the next step. The next step is to begin working on our fly. Our fly is piece 14. You should have cut out one of fabric and one of interfacing. I've already fused mine with interfacing. Now we're going to go ahead and finish off this long unnotched edge of it. I'm going to finish mine with my serger. So once you have the raw edge of the fly finished, we're going to go ahead and grab our pans, and working on the left front, we're going to go ahead and put right sides facing, matching up our notches as well as the large dot, and pin in place. Once you have it pinned, we're going to go ahead and stitch above the large dot, and make sure that you back stitch at the beginning and the end of your stitch. Now that we have it sewn on, we can go ahead and trim this down to 1/4 inch seam allowance. And we're only trimming above the large dot. Now that we have it trimmed, we can go ahead and do understitching, and we're going to make sure we have the seam allowance facing the fly, and go ahead and do our understitching now. Now that I have the understitching done, I'm going to go ahead and turn the fly to the inside and give it a good press. Now that we have it pressed, we can move on to the next step. The next step is for us to go ahead and top stitch along our marking, or basting if you hand basted or machine basted yours. I'm going to go ahead and put pins on the outside just to keep the fly in place. And I'm going to go ahead and top stitch following my stitching line. Now that the top stitching is done, we can go ahead and start working on our underlap. So go ahead and grab that, and we can start working on it now. For the underlap, you should have cut one of fabric as well as one of interfacing. I've already fused my interfacing. We're going to fold the underlap in half with wrong sides facing. Now we can take it to the machine, and we're going to machine baste the long edge as well as the lower edge. Once you have it machine basted, then you can finish off the edges with your serger, pick and shears, or zigzag stitch. So here's my underlap. I have it basted as well as I finished off the long and lower edge. So now we can grab our pants, and we can start working on the right front. So above the large circle, I'm going to press under 3/8 inch. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my iron. Okay, now that we have pressed in 3/8 inch above the large circle on our right front, we can move on to the next step. Next, we are going to take our underlap, and we are going to pin it to the right front edge, making sure that we match up the large circle. And we're going to take this pressed edge and line it up 1/8 inch over the seam line, and then make sure that you have the upper edges even at the top. So again, we're going to match up our large circle here at the bottom. Then we're going to take this pressed edge and line it up 1/8 inch over the seam line, and make sure that you have the raw edges even at the top. I'm going to go ahead and pin in place. Once you have it pinned in place, we can take it to the machine, and starting at the top, we're going to baste from the upper edge down to the large dot. Once you have the underlap basted, you want to go ahead and take your left front and lap it over the right. You also want to make sure the large dots at the bottom match up, and the left front, it should extend about 1/4 inch over on the right. So once you have the centers matching as well as the large dots, we can go ahead and take it back to the machine and do a regular stitch right along our basting line. Now that I have it stitched, I'm going to go ahead and remove my basting stitch. Okay, so I just removed my basting stitch. Now I'm going to go ahead and lap the left back over the right. I'm going to grab a pin just to hold it in place. And on the inside, down here at the lower edge, we're going to grab our needle and thread and we're going to hand tack the underlap to the fly. So I have my needle here and my thread, and I'm just going to hand tack it together. Alright, so I have my fly and my underlap tacked down here at the lower edge together. So now let's move on to the next step. For the next step, on the outside of the pant, right up under the fly stitching line that we made, we're going to create a bar tack through all thicknesses. If your machine doesn't have a bar tack function, you can just use narrow zigzag stitches right up under this fly stitching line. So let's go ahead and do that now. For sewing on my bar tack, I do have a bar tack function on my machine, so I'm just going to manually do mine. I'm going to put my needle down right by the fly stitching and start stitching the bar tack. Okay, once you have your bar tack on, we can go ahead and put our pants to the side and start working on our flaps. Okay, for our flaps, this is piece 13. You should have cut out 4 of these and 2 of interfacing, and I'm just going to put right sides facing. I'm going to pin along the sides and the lower edge. I'm going to go ahead and stitch in the 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, being sure to leave this top edge open. Okay, now that we have the flaps sewn, we can go ahead and trim them down. Now we can turn the pocket right side out and give it a good press. If you need your point turner, go ahead and grab it so you can poke out your corners. Once it's pressed, we can go ahead and take it to the machine. We're going to do a basting stitch at 5/8 of an inch seam allowance across this raw edge, and along the finished edge, we're going to do a top stitch at 1/4 of an inch, as well as make our buttonhole while we're at the machine. So let's go ahead and do that now. First, let's do the basting stitch. Now the top stitch at 1/4 of an inch. Now the buttonhole. Go ahead and do the basting, the top stitch, and the buttonhole on your other flap the same way. Okay, so I have my flaps done. Now I'm going to go ahead and place them onto the front of my pants. Now I transferred my dots, but I did not draw my line, so I'm going to go ahead and grab a ruler and just connect them. Okay, now that I have the line, I'm going to go ahead and grab my flap, and first I'm going to place it so that it is facing up, and I'm going to line up the small dots on my flap to the small dots on the line, and I'm going to put the basting stitch that we stitched at 5/8 of an inch, I'm going to put that right on the slanted line. So if we match up our small dots, our line will be right on our marking, and we can pin there. Now we can go ahead and stitch right along our basting line. Now we can go ahead and sew the other flap on the same way. Now that the flaps are sewn on, we can go ahead and trim down this seam allowance. Be careful not to cut into your pants. Once you have it trimmed, we can go ahead and turn the flap down, give it a press, and then we're going to top stitch at 1/4 inch right across the top of the flap. Top stitch the other flap the same way. Now that we have the flaps top stitched down, we're going to go ahead and form our pleats. So on the inside of our pants, you should have transferred your pleat lines. We're going to bring these lines together. I'm going to put a pin in. And we're going to stitch from the top down to the end of the pleat line. So let's go ahead and do that now. Again, make sure that you have your lines together and stitch from the top down to the end, and make sure you backstitch. Now that we have the pleat lines stitched, you want to go ahead and open up the pleat. We're going to grab our ironing board and press it flat. Now we can go ahead and baste across the top of the pleat. Now that the pleats are basted across the top, we can go ahead and sit our fronts to the side and start working on our backs. Okay, here are my 2 back pieces. The first thing that we're going to do is sew a row of stay stitching across the upper edge at 1/2 inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Once you have the back stay stitch, we can go ahead and pin our darts. Once you have it pinned, we can go ahead and stitch the darts. When you're sewing your dart, when you get to the end, you don't want to back stitch. Instead, just leave some long threads and then we can tie them in a knot. Now we can go ahead and sew the other dart. Once the darts are sewn, we want to go ahead and press them toward the center. So I have my iron here. I'm going to go ahead and press the darts. Okay, now let's move on to the next step. Next, we're going to go ahead and stitch our front to backs together at the side seams, right sides facing. Before I stitch mine together though, I'm going to go ahead and finish off my edges with my serger. I'm going to do that for my center seam as well as my inner leg seam on my backs and front pieces. Alright, so I've gone ahead and done all of my serging. I have my side seams done. I have my center seam done as well as the inner leg seam done. So now with right sides facing, I'm going to put my fronts and back together and pin the side seam. Once you have your side seams pinned, we can go to the machine and sew them in a 5/8 inch seam allowance. Now that I have the side seams sewn, I'm going to go ahead and press my seams open flat, and then we'll start working on the pocket. Now that I have my side seams pressed open, I'm going to go ahead and put these to the side and grab my side pocket, which is piece 17. So you should have cut out 2 of the side pockets, and what we're going to do is on the upper edge of the pocket, we're going to press under 1/4 inch seam allowance. So I have my iron here. I'm going to grab my seam gauge, put it at 1/4 inch, and I'm just going to press that over. Now that it's pressed, I'm going to flip it to the right side of the pocket, and I'm going to fold along my fold line. I snipped into the sides of mine, so I'm going to fold along the fold line. I'm going to grab a couple of pins just to hold it in place. Okay, from here I'm going to take it to the sewing machine, and we're going to stitch along the sides and the lower edges of the pocket along the seam line at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. So let's go ahead and do that now. Stitch along the seam line of your other pocket the same way. I have the pocket stitched along the seam line, so now I'm going to trim up here at this corner to eliminate some of the bulk. Now that it's snipped, we can go ahead and turn our pocket to the right side, and we can press along the stitching line. Do the other pocket the same way. Now that the pockets are pressed, we can take them to the machine and we can stitch close to this inner pressed edge. So I'm going to have my pocket facing up, and I'm going to top stitch right along this inner edge. Now that the pockets are stitched close to the inner pressed edge, I'm going to go ahead and grab my front and back pieces. And I'm going to find my side seam. Along your side seam, you should have transferred 4 dots. 2 of them are for the pocket, and the other 2 above that are for the flaps. So I'm going to go ahead and grab my pocket. Okay, I'm going to pin the pocket to the other side seam the same way, and then I'm going to take it to the machine and I'm going to stitch close to the edge along the side and the lower edges of the pocket. Alright, so I have the side pockets sewn on. The next step is to begin working on the flaps that will go over the side pocket. So we're going to go ahead and grab piece 18. I'm going to set my pants to the side. You should have cut out 4 of these and 2 interfacing. So with right sides facing, we're going to go ahead and pin along the sides and the lower edges of the pocket. Now we're going to go to the machine and stitch these along the side and the lower edges at a 3/8 of an inch seam allowance. Remember to leave the top open. Once we have the flaps sewn, we can go ahead and trim them. Okay, now we can go ahead and turn the flap right side out and give it a good press. Now that we have them pressed, we can go ahead and machine baste across the top, the raw edge, at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. And along the finished edge, we can top stitch at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. And then while we're still at the machine, go ahead and put your buttonhole on. Now that I have the flap sewn, I can go ahead and sew them onto the pant. So the same way that we did the other flap earlier, I'm going to put the pocket so that it's facing up to the pant. I'm going to line up my small dots with the small dots that are on my pants. The basting stitch should be lined up with the stitching line. I'm going to grab my pins. I'm going to go to the sewing machine. I'm going to stitch right across my basting stitch. Now that we have the flap sewn on, we can go ahead and trim it down close to the stitch. Be careful not to cut your pants. Now we're going to press the flap down and then top stitch right along this upper edge at a 1/4 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have the flap top stitch, now we can go ahead and pin our inner leg seam together. So with right sides facing, you want to line up your notches and pin in place. Once you have the inner leg seams pinned, we can go ahead and stitch them at a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Once you have your inner leg seam sewn, we're going to go ahead and press that. Okay, once your inner leg seam is pressed out, now we can go ahead and put one pant leg inside the other, making sure that right sides are facing. So I'm going to turn one of the pant legs out, and I'm going to put it inside the other. Again, making sure that I have right sides facing. Now I'm going to pin at the inner leg seam. I'm going to pin the remainder center seam together, matching my notches. And continue pinning all the way up here at our previous stitch. I'm going to pin there as well. So now we can go to the sewing machine and we can stitch our center seam all the way to this previous stitching, and then we're going to stitch over that same stitch again just to reinforce it. So let's go ahead and stitch the center seam now. Now I'm going to go ahead and stitch again right over the stitch just to reinforce it. Once we have the center seam sewn, we can go ahead and set the pants to the side for just a moment and grab our carrier piece. Should have cut out one carrier. What we're going to do is fold the carrier in half lengthwise. And make sure that you have the wrong sides facing. So first, let's fold it in half. Give it a good press. Now we're going to open it out, and we're going to fold in the raw edges to the crease that we just made and press those down. Same thing for the other long edge. Fold the raw edge into the crease and press it. Now we can fold it back in half. Now that the carrier piece is pressed, we can go ahead and take it to the machine, and we're going to stitch down both long ends of the carrier, getting close as we can to the edge. Now that we have our carrier piece sewn, we can go ahead and cut it into 8 pieces that are 3 inches long. Once you have your 8 carriers, we can go ahead and grab our pants and pin them in place. On the outside of the pants, we're going to go ahead and pin our carriers in place, and I can see my markings through the pants, so I'm just going to go ahead and line those up and pin them in place. Make sure that you have the raw edges even with the top. Now we can go to our sewing machine and baste across the top of our carriers. Continue basting your other carriers in place. Once we have the carriers basted on, we can go ahead and put the pants to the side for just a moment and start working on our waistband. On our waistband, we have a side that is unnotched and a side that is notched. On the side that is unnotched, we're going to fold in a 1/2 inch and give it a press. So go ahead and grab your iron and press in a 1/2 inch on the unnotched edge. Now that we have the waistband pressed at a 1/2 inch on the long unnotched edge, let's go ahead and pin it to the pants. Alright, so with right size facing, we're going to go ahead and match up our notches as well as match up the small dots with the side seams. Once you have your waistband pinned all the way around, we can go ahead and stitch it in a 5/8 of an inch seam allowance. Now that we have the waistband sewn on, we can go ahead and trim our seam down. Now we can go ahead and press our seam up toward the waistband. Alright, now that I have the seam pressed up toward the waistband, on the front of the waistband, I'm going to go ahead and fold it right sides facing onto itself like so. Going to grab a pin and pin it in place. Same thing for the other side. Fold it right sides facing onto itself. Pin it in place. Now we can take it to the sewing machine and we can stitch the ends together and then trim our seam. Once the ends are stitched, we can go ahead and trim them. Turn them right side out. Now we can go ahead and press the band to the inside of the pants. Once you have it pressed, we can go ahead and grab our pins and we're going to pin it so that the folded edge of the waistband is about 1/8 of an inch over that seam. So go ahead and put your pins on the outside. Once you have it pinned, we can go to the sewing machine and stitch in the ditch, making sure that we catch this pressed edge while we're sewing. So let's go ahead and do that now. Once you have the waistband sewn on, we can go ahead and press up our carriers, and then we can fold under 3/8 of an inch and pin the carriers down. So now I'm going to go ahead and press them up and then press under 3/8 of an inch and pin them down. Go ahead and pin your carriers to the top of the waistband. Once we have them all pinned, we can go to the sewing machine and stitch them right across the top of the fold. After you have the carrier sewn on, I'm going to go ahead and start working on the hem of our pants. On the inside, I snipped along the fold line, so I'm going to go ahead and fold up along the hem and press that up. I'll turn the pants inside out and fold it up. Here are my snips right here. I'm going to grab my ironing board and press this up. Once you have the hem pressed up, we're going to fold in 1/4 of an inch on the raw edge and then press along that as well. Once you have the cuff pressed up and you've pressed in 1/4 of an inch on that raw edge, we can go ahead and stitch it close to this pressed edge. Now that we have the cuff sewn, we're going to go ahead and turn the cuff to the outside up 3 inches. So this is the right side of my pant, this is the inside, and I just turned up the cuff 3 inches. I'm going to get my seam gauge. So again, this is the pant after it's been sewn, and I'm just folding up 3 inches to the outside. Now working at the seams only, right where I have my pins at, you can do a French tack to tack this cuff up to the seam, or you can stitch in the ditch of the seam through all thicknesses. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm just going to stitch just a little bit to tack down the cuff. I'm going to do that for all the seams. So there, I stitched in the ditch, and I'm going to do that for the other 3 seams. After you have your cuff folded up and tacked along all the seams, we can go ahead and give our pants a really good press. And the last step for us to do is to go ahead and apply our buttons and buttonholes. So following your buttonhole markings, you want to go ahead and create your buttonholes on the left front and also on the waistband. Put your buttons on the right and up under your flaps and along your pocket. Once you have all of your buttonholes made and your buttons sewn on, we're all done with our pants. Well, that's all for the sew along. Thank you all so much for watching. I really do hope that you all enjoyed it. Until next time, blessings everyone. Bye.